Without question, Gregory is influenced by kind of Neoplatonic schools of thought. But Neoplatonism itself is influenced by certain strands of Aristotle. And what he's kind of, the Christian theologian he's kind of probably most influenced by is this guy called Origen of Alexandria, who lived in the early 2nd century. Famous and very important biblical scholar. Thomas Aquinas almost certainly did not read Gregory of Nyssa, because Thomas Aquinas couldn't read Greek. And Gregory of Nyssa kind of, I don't want to say disappeared, because in the East, he had been studied forever. Thomas Aquinas would have known stuff from the different councils. And so Augustine is kind of just a little bit younger than Gregory of Nyssa. Gregory of Nyssa, his brother is called Basil. Their friend is called Gregory of Nazianzus, and the three of them together are called the Cappadocian Fathers. All three of these guys are really influential. But one of the things I hoped, and you guys clearly got this just by a first go reading without even me telling you anything, the picture is a lot more complicated than, he's a lot more modern, right? He seems to be pretty cutting edge in some ways, in a way that dude lived in the 4th century, what does he know? But no, it's a very complex picture. So teasing out its complexity and kind of layers of the different threads of where people come from. Obviously, that's our task for the day.
The reason I mentioned Aquinas, by the way, is because early on and then later on, he's talking about how do things get created.
Right, exactly.
And ultimately, you come back to the Aristotelian notion of a prime mover.
Sure.
The Thomistic notion of a prime mover, but it's interesting that they may never have.
Right, exactly.
Thomas may never have even read
Yeah, Thomas was definitely read Aristotle, like commented on different Aristotelian treatises. But the Aristotle Thomas read was in Latin, and the Latin was made from an Arabic translation, and the Arabic translation was from the Greek, right? So it's a few removed. But Thomas and his insights on Aristotle are just like, he's probably the best commentator ever on Aristotle. Let alone the theological stuff, but just like what Thomas Aquinas, like how Thomas Aquinas understands Aristotle's philosophy it's really kind of second to none. But anyway, I think here's the main question we kind of always should be coming back to. What does it mean to be, well, obviously when we talked about, when you guys have been talking about the brain, or like, you know, one of the Andrew brothers came and talked to you about like the different neurosurgery stuff he does, right? At what point, when we're talking about us as people, Scott Morinigiello, 5'10", $170, you know, like, what does it mean when I'm talking about myself? What exactly am I talking about? Right? That's really the question, ultimately. And that's a question that for Gregory is best answered by talk about the soul, rather than talk about the body, or rather than talk about the mind or the brain. Right? Now, talk about the brain and the mind and the body are all important to talk about the soul, but they're not. Again, this question of how do we, like, what's reducible to what? Human beings aren't simply reducible to bodies or to brains or to minds. I think that's the kind of major thing. So let's look at some of the stuff he says. So first on the kind of definition of the soul. So page 4, give me a good definition. Yeah, right. Read it. Yeah, you can read it.
The soul is in essence.
Oh, and let me say one last thing about the kind of context. You can tell it's a dialogue, right? He's talking to his sister. Her name isn't mentioned here, but her name is Macrina, and she's dying. And their brother Basil has already died, and there are all these doctors around. They're like people around them, right? And he's asking about the soul. So there's a particular context that he's worried about his sister's death. He's worried about what's going to happen to her. And she comes across as just like mad chill about the whole thing. She's not worried. She's obviously very lucid. I mean, probably this was mostly made up, right? But very lucid, not afraid. And so he's worried about her. Is he going to see her again? What does it mean for him to see her again? Who is she ultimately? Right? And he asks really good questions. I mean, again, the kind of questions we might ask. Well, what does it mean when Paul says X? She says, okay, let's go through that and figure it out. Okay.
Should I read the part before it?
Sure, why not?
Sure. What then, I asked, is the soul? Perhaps there may be some possible means of dealing in its nature, so that we may have some comprehension of the subject in the way of a sketch. Its definition, the teacher replied, has been attempted in different ways by different writers, each according to his own bent. But the following is our opinion about it. The soul is in essence created, living, and intellectual, transmitting from itself to an organizing sentient body, power of living and of grasping an object of sense, as long as the natural constitution capable of this holds together.
Good. What does that mean? That's the question. And there are other parts where she seems to define it too. Well,
Well, she mentions intellectual, which some other philosophers like Augustine have mentioned different, like I might say tiers of souls, where
yeah,
it builds to like an intellectual soul. But I mean, this might imply that she's only thinking that humans have souls and the intellectual.
yeah. Plato kind of famously has this idea that there's appetitive souls and desirous souls and then intellectual souls. So she's following him on that. But notice that those plants have souls. Now, what does that mean? It means that plants have kind of essences. There's something like plantness about a plant. Right? And so, like when you chop off a plant to like prune it, it's still the same plant, even though it has fewer leaves. Well, how can we talk about that way, right? And what is it about human beings that makes human beings in some way different? Good. What else? What other definitions?
She also says that the soul transmits the power of living and of grasping objects of sense to the body.
Yeah. Go ahead.
It's almost as if like the soul is separate and it needs to communicate with it, like with the body. It's strange thing.
Yeah. One of those.
So is he basically a dualist then?
Well.
Yeah.
Well, it depends on what you mean by dualism, right? This is always tricky. What exactly do you mean by dualism? Because in one way, remember he says, Macrina says, when does your soul come to be? Let's start to exist. Well, let me put it this way. Does your soul exist before you're born? Does your soul exist before you're a body? That's one way to answer the dualism question.
No.
Why not?
I don't remember in here where there's something necessary to the body.
Yeah, to be yourself, you need to have a body. You're not yourself without your body, right? You are your body. So if he were a dualist, then he might well say something like, well, your soul's out there, and then like meet your body, and like, kind of like goofy stuff, right? Say again?
Plato talks about that a little bit.
Yeah, and there was this guy Origen seemed to suggest that there were pre-existent souls. He seemed to have gotten this from Plato. Gregory doesn't think that's the case. So he's certainly not a dualist in that way. And so then the question is, well, the soul is in essence created and living and intellectual, transmitting from itself to an organized sentient body the power of living and grasping objects of sense, as long as natural constitution capable of this holds together. Part of the issue, go ahead.
That almost suggests that the soul isn't immortal, right? Like,
Yeah, the way in which the soul is immortal is weird.
yeah.
It's not quite what we might think it is. And it's not quite what it would be on a kind of dualist picture, I think. One tricky question, and biologists worry about this, for example. Like, what does it mean for something to be alive? Like, at what point does something stop being dead? Or stop being inanimate? Right, even the word inanimate, without the soul. What it means. At what point does something start being alive? Even we worry about this like end-of-life stuff. Like brain death doesn't count as death. Right? Your heart failure doesn't count as death. Like at what point, right? This is again part of what's tricky about how Gregory is getting at these things. What else about his definitions of soul, or how else does he just talk about it that's go ahead.
Well, I know he says that like all organisms have souls, right?
Right.
But he also says that it's intellectual in nature.
Well, the human soul is
Okay, so he's saying like it's a different soul.
different, right?
They're all different, but like they have to be the same in some way, don't they? Like because they're still all souls. Like it's like I don't know.
Right. So if it, different animals have different body parts that are the same,
Yeah.
more or less. So monkeys have hands and human beings have hands.
Yeah.
So there's no handness that human beings and
I
monkeys
see, I
share.
see.
Right. So there's a soulness that human beings and monkeys share, insofar as they have souls. But they're not the same kind of soul in the same way the monkey hand and the human hand is the same
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Is it-
Yeah.
I was gonna say, like, are there like different levels of souls, like with like plants?
Right,
insects,
exactly. Yeah.
Animals and humans.
Yeah. And he doesn't think that everybody shares. Like, one thing on option is like, well, maybe everybody shares in the same soul. There's just kind of like soul ether out there that everybody shares in. He doesn't think that's right, because that would mean that we weren't ourselves.
He doesn't believe that it occupies physical space, or at least like the space of our body. I mean, because it
Yeah, where
transfers from
this is
itself
important. Yeah.
to the sentient body.
Right.
Which, I remember Cartesian duality got a lot
Right.
into that kind of like.
Right, because Descartes thinks that it's like a pituitary gland that it kind of
Yeah.
meets.
Pineal gland?
Pineal gland. Pineal gland, sorry. It's kind of weird. Right, Descartes is a genius. I'm loath to say he's wrong. I think he's wrong on that.
Control sleep cycles.
What?
It controls sleep cycles.
Right.
Yeah, but it's also in the center of the brain, right?
That was one.
Right.
That was
Well,
it.
but not really.
But here's the thing, right? For Gregory, my soul is as much my pinky as it is my brain. Descartes would have thought that was bizarre. What?
Oh, you said brain. Pinky's the brain.
I would. There's got to be something to that. Talk about that.
Uncovering philosophies in old kids' TV shows.
Well, these guys are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. These guys are like make these shows. Yeah. Anyway,
So we're talking about
Brain and
essence and substance.
I
This is
think,
what cinema's
yeah,
all
I
about.
think that, so that, what does it mean to be you? That's the kind of question the soul answers.